Now we shall start with our second session, COVID deaths, grief and its management. And I will call Chairperson Dr. Arun Marwaya sir. He is our Vice President, come President-elect IPS Western Zonal Branch. He is a Chairperson Membership Committee IPS Western Zonal Branch and a well-known psychiatrist Aurangabad. And Dr. Amar Shinde, Consultant Psychiatrist from Pune, and he is director of Jagruti Rehabilitation Center. So now I'll request the chairperson and co-chairperson to start the session.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Already we are late, almost 20 minutes late behind our regular session. So the next speaker is Dr. Abhijit Nadkarni. So he will be speaking on COVID-19, grief and its management. All of us actually during our practice do counsel the patients coming with grief. But this COVID-19 pandemic had actually created a havoc, and where this grief counseling was needed much. It was, need of the time. And being a topic very near to heart of almost all psychiatrists, I hope he will give justice. Dr. Nadkarni will give justice to this topic so that we can proceed more effectively with grief counseling and its management. So I request, before that, I thank the organizing committee, particularly the chairperson, Dr. Sarode, the organizing secretary, Dr. Kalmeg and his team. So also the IPS West Zone secretary for giving this opportunity to chair this session and honor me. And I hand over the mic now to Dr. Amar Shinde, our EC member. Thank you.
Thank you, Marwai sir. This COVID has affected everything, including our conferences. So I congratulate these IPS conference organizers for arranging such a wonderful conference. And thanks for giving me opportunity. Today's speaker is COVID death and grief and its management, Dr. Abhijit Nadkarni. He has done MBBS, DPM, MRC Psych, MSc in Mental Health Services Research, PhD in Epidemiology. Working as Associate Professor, Global Mental Health, Department of Population Health, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Ongoing Research Fellow, is also honorary consultant psychiatrist and co-director, Addiction Research Group, Sangarth, Goa, India. He is also honorable consultant addiction psychiatrist, South London and Medusley NHS Foundation Trust, UK. Had published about 70 articles in national and international journals. Also authored 5 books and chapters. Was visiting researcher, Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, Neuroscience, King's College, London. Had worked as a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow and Department of Population and Health. So I welcome Dr. Abhijit Nadkarni to give a talk on COVID death, grief and its management, the most touching subject for psychiatrists in this COVID era. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to talk about this important topic. It's always a great pleasure. It's always a great pleasure to come here and contribute to the West Zone IPS West Zone branch annual conference. This is the third time I have been invited. And obviously, with the COVID pandemic and then this conference going hybrid, you don't get to see the usual faces. I'm seeing some people I know here, but I mean, we're kind of so used to meeting people from the zone at these conferences that this feels different. But such as that may be, we have to kind of live with this changing world and get on with life. And so a hybrid conference, so be it, hopefully in the coming years or coming year, the conference would be face to face where we get to meet. I took the liberty of changing the title of the topic a little bit. And I think and I think the key word in the title, at least for me, is neither death nor grieving nor COVID-19. The key word here is changing. And I think we need to stress on the word changing is because what I'm going to talk about today, as with multiple topics around COVID-19, things will change. The pandemic is still evolving. We are getting to learn more about it as we go along. Similarly, the mental health effects of the pandemic and the things that happen because of the pandemic are going to evolve and knowledge is going to change. So what I say today might not apply a month down the line. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on the current knowledge on this topic. But we have to understand that the situation is pretty dynamic and changing, and our knowledge and consequently what we'll do when we come across someone who is experiencing grieving due to death of a closed one is also going to change over time. But let's take a step back before we move on to the more technical bits of the talk and kind of try to understand why we need to have this talk. Since the past couple of years or so now, the COVID pandemic has been proceeding across the world and leaving behind it in its wake death and disaster and grief for a lot of people. As happened with the second surge in India, the number of people dying from COVID-19 in India and in other parts of the world increased a lot this year, and which also meant that there was an exponential increase in people around us being touched by other people who had either passed away or knowing people whose family members or other loved ones had passed away. This brings with it its own set of complications because none of us anywhere in the world would have experienced death at this scale. All of us in our memories have at least, in our adult memories, have at least one event that we can recall where there has been massive deaths and destruction. Personally, for me, the memories would be around 9/11 in 2001, the terrorist attacks, and the tsunami in India in 2004. Both led to a lot of death and destruction. Even if it was of strangers, it tends to affect us. But none of it has happened at the scale at which what's happening with the pandemic, which means that the abilities of people to deal with deaths at this scale have to be exponentially increased beyond the abilities that people have. But what it has also done is for us to become better at having conversations around death, around grief, around bereavement. These are not conversations or narratives that happen easily. And this pandemic, if one of the positive things that might have come out of this pandemic is people are able to talk about death and grieving, I think, which is very, very important. Let's keep that aside and look at the numbers. I mean, as of yesterday, from the Johns Hopkins dashboard that they maintain, these were the deaths that have happened because of COVID. The one on my left is the world number of deaths, and the one on my right is the number of deaths in India. And let's give it some perspective. Let's look at it from the frame of reference of deaths that have occurred because of other causes. What does affect us most in the contemporary world when it comes to death is terrorism. At the bottom of this slide, you will see the number of deaths that have occurred from 2006 to 2019. In none of the years have these numbers been in any way at all close to what we have seen because of the pandemic. And I'm sure, I mean, I've not really added it, but just eyeballing the numbers on this slide, if we were to add up all of the deaths that have happened from 2006 to 2019 across the world, the numbers will be lower than what has happened because of the pandemic in the past 2 years. So having established that this is a disaster of monumental scale, what do we know about its effects on people when it comes to grieving and bereavement? The evidence shows that if you lose a loved one from COVID-19, the grief that you experience is much, much more intense than people who have lost someone through other kinds of death. Besides it being more intense, it also has a significant effect on impairing people's ability to function in various domains, be it personal life, professional life, or social domains. And finally, the high levels of these functional impairment happen because of three reasons. One is dysfunctional grief. Second one is distress because of separation from your loved one. And third, as one would expect, is PTS, post-traumatic stress. But again, those are just numbers. What I spoke about earlier, the number of times people are at risk of developing grief in terms of risk are all numbers. And that's all very good. But we have to listen to the stories behind these numbers. And there's a reason why we should be doing that. I think at the best of times, Joseph Stalin from Russia is not the best person to quote in any kind of an gathering. At the very least, in an academic gathering, it's not the best place. But he did say one thing which has a lot of parallels to what is happening right now. He had said, in a completely different context, and not in a good way, but he had said that one death is a tragedy, million deaths is a statistic. And that's what's happening around the world because of the pandemic. Because so many people have died, we run the risk of merely looking at it as a statistic and losing our ability to empathize. And hence, it's important for us to be listening to these stories of ordinary people that have come out from the pandemic. I'm sure all of us have heard of multiple people in the same family dying. I'm sure we have heard of children being orphaned because both their parents died because of the pandemic. And then there are these other stories. There's the story of this pregnant dentist who took all her precautions in a clinical work, but ostensibly got infected with COVID-19 at home. And in her final days, she was making videos urging people to take COVID very, very seriously. There are stories of this young mother who was on a non-invasive ventilator waiting to get a bed in the ICU, who was seen enjoying a peppy Bollywood number about enjoying life a few days before she died. There are stories about the pregnant woman who was a school teacher and got infected while she was on government duty at the Panchayat elections in one of our northern Indian states. And then the most chilling of all of this, at least for me, was the story of the journalist who was tweeting to get help even as he was gasping for breath and was not able to get into a hospital ICU. And he actually was live tweeting the worsening of his condition and his death. I mean, nothing can be as chilling as a story like that. And so these are the stories that sit behind those numbers. So numbers do tell us a story, but they don't tell us the full story. It's these kind of real people stories that alert us to the level of the problem. Before moving on, let's take a step back and just understand the concepts that we are going to talk about so that there's no confusion about what I'm going to talk about here today. So one is bereavement, which is the experience of losing a loved one. And the other thing is grief, which is a natural response to bereavement. The emotions that it leads to are intense, Sometimes people feel overwhelmed because of them. They change over time. They are multifaceted. That means that there could be different types of emotions that a person will experience if they are grieving. It doesn't always progress in a smooth, linear manner. There are fluctuations. There will be good days, there will be bad days. But the good news is that most people will, over a reasonable period of time, will adapt to that grief and move on. So that's the good news. The bad news is some people don't. And the worst news is that COVID-19 has created a situation to make it difficult for people to grieve and naturally adapt to it and move on. If we look at normal circumstances of how people will proceed and adapt to this grief, these are the set of steps that people go through. First, they try to understand the experiences that they're having with regards to grief and make their peace with it. Then gradually they start coming out and start feeling a purpose in their life, feeling of belongingness. You start making new relationship or strengthening old relationships outside of the relationships that you had with the person who passed away. You become more comfortable in talking about your relationship with the person who died and the relationship that you had with them and the events around the death. And gradually, over time, you internalize the memories of the person, and that's your memorial to them, and that stabilizes the intense and the fluctuating nature of the grief. So these are the steps that people progress through from the point that they experience the bereavement to the point that they start adapting. But this is under normal circumstances. What we are talking about are exceptional circumstances. What happens in normal circumstances is for various reasons not happening during the pandemic. And one of the things that's happening is the lack of normally socially sanctioned funeral activities that happen when a person passes away. And it's important to kind of think about this because funerals do tend to have a therapeutic function. They allow the family members to crystallize the passing away of that person because you're actually seeing the person in front of you going through the various rituals of the funeral. They allow people to think about death, their own mortality, and allowing that thinking to be integrated into their lives. It allows other people in society to provide support and compassion to the person who is bereaved. So it's helpful for the person who is grieving, but it's also helpful for other loved ones who want to convey their love and respect to the person who has passed away. But what is different this time is that this is not happening. But let's keep that aside for the moment and look at the evidence based on the function of funerals. All of this is all very fine, but when research has been done on the function of funerals, the evidence is mixed. In some studies, it has shown to be helpful. In others, it's shown not to be helpful. But what we know for sure is from the qualitative studies that have accompanied these type of studies, where it shows that when the funeral rituals are things over which the bereaved person has control and are designed to meet the needs, the psychological and social needs of the bereaved person left behind, they are helpful. So what is different then? So these are the normal ways of grieving, the normal process of grieving, and the normal rituals around grieving. What is different this time? There are several things that are different. So one thing that's different is around the kind of loss that people are experiencing, which is different. And the other is around the context of those loss. So what is different about the losses? The primary loss everyone knows about. When someone dies, that's a primary loss. But along with that, there are several other secondary losses that are happening, which we don't pay attention to. These secondary losses are loss of companionship, lack of sexual intimacy, loss of function, loss of social connections, loss of financial security, loss of function. All of these things are secondary losses and a lot more impactful and have a deleterious effect on people's mental health beyond the primary loss. Because of the pandemic, people are also experiencing multiple losses at the same time. Some of these losses are stigmatized. If a person having COVID passes away, the family gets stigmatized for contracting the illness and potentially passing on the illness. So the loss is stigmatized. The loss is disenfranchised. Why is that? Because there is no appropriate validation of the funeral processes anymore because of the pandemic. There is no social sanction to grieving in the way which we are used to grieving, which means that people do not get validated in their rights to grieve for the person who has passed away. And finally, anticipatory grief when one of your loved ones is in a bad shape and in hospital and most likely to die, and you start grieving even before the person dies. So that's to do with how these losses are different. And this is to do with how the context is different. When you lose a family member because of the pandemic, all of these things are problematic. The public health measures that have been put in place, and rightly so, to ensure or reduce the spread of the virus means that people are not able to grieve the way they would in funerals. The number of people who can attend the funerals has reduced. Certain social rituals which provide support, such as sitting with the person who is grieving, shaking hands, hugging, all of that cannot be done, which again takes away from the protective nature of the funerals and other rituals that happen around the funeral. Well, as a people, global citizens, we are pretty resilient, and we have found some ways around this. We have found innovative ways of ensuring that we are able to grieve to a certain extent. And these are some examples of what people have done. I'm not going to read out all of those, but these are innovative things that people have done, which have helped people to deal with the grief. But keeping in mind that many of these things might not be relevant for certain religions. Many of these things might not be relevant for certain contexts because a lot of these are dependent on technology, and always everyone does not have access to the best of technologies. And so these are just some examples. Doesn't necessarily mean that we shall be able to do all of this, but just to highlight the point that in the face of difficult circumstances and challenges in grieving, people have been pretty proactive and innovative in how they have gone about grieving. As I said earlier, most people will adapt to grief over time through a natural process. But then there are other people who will not. And a lot of time it depends on several things, such as the context of the death, the relationship that the person left behind had with the person who died, the kind of social support that they get and is available to them. These are all things that affect adaptation. And the challenges to adaptation are neatly summarized in this acronym called derailers. These are very simple things if we think about this. Doubt about whether you did everything that you could or whether you could have done something differently. Having false beliefs that the only way to honor the person who has died is being intensely grief-stricken. If only thinking, if only I had done this, this person could have survived. Negative emotions like anger and bitterness. Beliefs that the death was unfair. Why did it happen to my loved one? Why should it happen now? Not having the belief that you'll be able to adjust and adapt to the circumstances, change circumstances. Avoidance of reminders of the loss. So you avoid any kind of contact with things that you reminds you of the person who died. Not taking support from anyone around you. And finally, survivor guilt. Why did this need to happen to that person, and why did I survive? All of this, one or more, if they exist, are more likely to lead to a prolonged grief disorder. And then there are risk factors for complicated grief. which are around the circumstances of the death, the context of the death, and the consequences of the death. So if the death was sudden, seemingly preventable, if the person died alone in hospital ICU, restrictions on visiting policies of the dying family members, unemployment worries, feeling unsafe about the virus, financial insecurity, and then the consequences of the death. If there is two of them living and one of the partner dies, that's a risk factor. The fear of getting contaminated by the virus because you were caring for the person who died and had COVID, having to care for others, so one parent dying and the other parent then having to take care of young children, and financial worries. All of these are risk factors for complicated grief. And then there are the social and contextual risks that have come from COVID-19 themselves, which are basically around not allowing people to have appropriate, culturally sanctioned funerals which have a therapeutic function, as I earlier said, and a lot of restrictions that have been put in place do not allow people to do that. So all of this is very fine. You could turn around to me and say, you have just told us the problems. We know that there are problems. And just stating problems is not enough unless we can state some solutions or some relief to that. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. But let's start off with what we shouldn't be doing. First thing is not to use sedative hypnotic medications for people who are experiencing grief. If at all needs to be used, then use them judiciously and use them for a very short period of time. Remember that depression-specific treatments are not going to work for grief disorders. And finally, do not misdiagnose or be careful not to misdiagnose grief as depression. Those are the don'ts, and these are the do's. It's very important for us to have the knowledge about grieving, bereavement, and how COVID-19 affects it. Unless we have that knowledge, we can't provide appropriate care. It's important to have open discussions with people who are experiencing grief, helping them to adapt better, being able to identify the derailers which would lead to prolonged grief disorder, helping your client to identify the emotions that they're experiencing and labeling them. Because as I said earlier, people who are grieving experience a range of confusing emotions, mixed emotions, and they are not able to label them. What is this that's happening to me? Helping them to recognize those emotions and labeling them is very important. And supporting them in thinking about how some of the thoughts that I spoke earlier, why only me, kind of questions, you need to help them to work through those questions and thoughts that people have. It's very important to validate all the emotions that people are experiencing. It's not about minimizing them. It's about understanding that this is something that they are really experiencing, validating it, and helping them to move forward. Reminding that natural process of grieving is that things will change over time. Helping them to understand that they did things best to the best of their abilities, and helping them understand that these are things that you can control. These are things that you cannot control. There is no point in fretting about things that you can't control. Help them to build and strengthen their social networks. Psychoeducate them so that they understand and are able to identify symptoms of common mental disorders like depression and anxiety, and sometimes suicidal thoughts if they arise. Provide non-pharmacological support to help people sleep better, so good sleeping habits and sleep hygiene. And promote self-care, because there are limits to what you can do. Self-care is very important because it's something that they themselves can do. And what are these things? These are some of the principles of self-care in people who are grieving. They have to understand and accept the grief. They have to be kind to themselves. They have to involve themselves in activities and relationships and social connections which they enjoy and find pleasurable. They have to strengthen relationships with others outside of the relationship that they had with the person who passed away. Give them an opportunity to talk with other people about what they're experiencing. help them to internalize the grieving process and the person who has passed away so that they become a memory inside, develop a sense of connection with the deceased, observe, reflect on, and label their feelings, which they have to do themselves. They can remember and honor their loved ones in creative ways, as some of the things that I spoke about earlier. Accepting their feelings, good feelings as well as not so good feelings, is very, very important. And understanding that eventually healing will occur, but it will occur at its own pace. It varies from person to person. There'll be good days and there'll be bad days. And not to postpone the mourning, because if you postpone the mourning, it's not going to go away. It's going to fester and come out in a more complicated manner in the future. So doing mourning at the appropriate time is very, very important as a part of self-care. As clinicians, it's very important for us to remember that we have to be able to identify prolonged grief disorder, because that's something that will require treatment. It's associated with worsening of physical health. It's associated with depression, anxiety. It affects people's cognitions. It's associated with substance use disorders, people using substances to support themselves. And overall, it worsens people's quality of life. Besides prolonged grief disorder, people can also experience depression, anxiety, and PTSD, which is independent of the prolonged grief disorder. And we have to be mindful of those and keep our eyes and ears open for that. And what do I mean by prolonged grief disorder? These are the criteria that you have to fulfill for prolonged grief disorder: ICD-11 proposed and DSM-5. Slight differences, but I think the message remains the same. I'm not going to read out all of this. I will leave this on for a few moments so that you can quickly read through this. But this is what prolonged grief disorder looks like. What do we do when we come across prolonged grief disorder? There is no role for pharmacotherapy in prolonged grief disorder. There is no evidence base to show that any medication, including antidepressants, will work in prolonged grief disorder. So that's out. Antidepressants have a role to play if the person has co-occurring depression. Then you can start the individual on antidepressants. Doing risk assessments for suicidal thoughts, plans, behaviors, extremely important on a regular basis. But the front line of treatment for prolonged grief disorder is psychotherapy. And the psychotherapy for which there is the best evidence is called complicated grief therapy. This is the first line of treatment. It's one which has the most evidence. The two key principles that you are trying to achieve through complicated grief therapy is, one, helping them build their social networks beyond what they had before the person died, and reducing the avoidance of reminders of the deceased. Because one of the things that I said happens when you get into a complicated grief is you try to avoid reminders of that person. So these are the two key things that you should be doing. There's evidence to show that complicated grief therapy is superior to interpersonal therapy. It's superior to antidepressants, and it is superior to pill placebo. So this should be your first line of care. And what is it that you do in these sessions? It's basically the general principles of client-centered counseling. So active listening, empathetic listening, reflection, all of the things that you do in Rogerian counseling. And then the two important things that I spoke about. One is re-engaging with life and building up social networks, and two, activation, which is basically getting involved in activities that you find pleasurable. Before I finish, I want to highlight a little bit about children and grief, because that, as we know, is slightly different as experienced by adults, and they do deserve a separate consideration. The first thing is, based on the developmental pathway that children are on, the way they process grief and death would differ. So how a 5-year-old processes death is different from how a 7-year-old processes death, which is different from how a 9-year-old processes death. A 5-year does not understand the permanence of death, that the person who's died will not come back. That's the level of cognitive development that's happened. The 7-year-old begins to understand that, but can develop an extreme fear of death and become clingy and worry about their adult parents dying. And a 9-year-old is now starting to completely understand the permanence of death, and we can start having adult conversations with them appropriate for that developmental age, because they do have curiosities about death and dying. The behavioral reactions that young people have are also going to be different from what adults have. And these again are dependent on where they are on their developmental trajectory. So for example, a 5-year-old might have regressive behaviors such as bedwetting or thumb sucking. On the other hand, a 9-year-old who has started to understand permanence of death better then might feel guilty about the person passing away, might blame themselves for the death, might become very clingy and tearful to their parents because they're worried about the adults in their life dying. And at the other extreme are children who will not be affected at all and will carry on life as nothing has happened, which is not problematic as well, because that's not like denial that adults might have, where they kind of delay the mourning. With some children, just can't process it at that cognitive level, and hence they carry on with life as it was before the death. The issue is sometimes with how we as adults react to the child's response. When the child acts out because of all of the things that I spoke about earlier, our reaction is to shout at them or punish them. And this is a reflection about our conceptualization of death. As adults, we fear death. As adults, we are fearful of dying. And so we feel that having adult conversations with children about death and dying might traumatize them. And so our reaction to any kind of responses that children might have to death and grieving is to not have the conversation, silence them, and kind of punish them at times. So the things that we have to be looking for in children, which would get us worried and get us to seek help from professionals who are able to work with children, is changes in the behavior of the child, acting out, not interested in daily activities, changing in biological function, and persistent anxiety, sadness, or depression. What can children do, or parents do, to help the children who is grieving? They should allow the child to ask questions, very, very important. And they should answer those questions based on the developmental level of the child. Should give them permission to grieve. They are allowed to grieve the loss of a loved one. Practice calming and coping strategies, which you are practicing yourself as a parent so that they can mirror and reflect. Try to maintain routines as much as possible. Greater the disruption in routine, more distressing it is for children. And spend time with the child doing activities that they love doing, such as painting, going for walks, playing games, anything that gives them pleasure. Spend time, dedicated time to help them. So that's all from me on this topic. I think the key messages here are, to use the much cliched term, we are in unprecedented times. Things are different in various domains of our life, and there is no reason why a natural process that we have been dealing with in the past, which is bereavement and grieving over bereavement, shouldn't change. It has changed for a range of reasons. We are living in a world where the chances of people experiencing bereavement has improved or increased exponentially. And so we are going to come across such people in our clinical practice. It's important that we are able to identify problematic grieving and provide appropriate evidence-based care when we come across such clients. Thank you.
Mic is not. Hello. So before I comment on the presentation, there is instruction for the technical support team. There are many comments that background music is running and that's making no sense. So will you please take care of it? So that's the instruction. So that the next sessions will not be disturbed. Coming to the presentation itself, thank you very much, Dr. Abhijit. Since a pretty long time, because of this COVID pandemic, I could hear such an excellent live session today only. It was really wonderful. Actually, you have tried to cover lot many things. On grief and its management, particularly how sudden and multiple deaths affect the population, how it caused the dysfunctional grief and distress. You talked about all the stages of grief and the emotional chaos the people will have and how to handle that. You talked about death of pregnant woman, I mean dentist and teacher. That actually reminded me one of our psychiatric student also, resident from Mumbai, MJ Medical College. Actually, she got married before a year or so, and during her residency, she was given COVID duties. In spite, she was pregnant, and she was doing it. She was honest enough, and she succumbed to this one, and that actually, emotionally we were disturbed because she was one of the students of our institute. I mean, our brother institute, you can say. You talked about different emotions and how to deal with them. You said, as usual, funeral gives us opportunity to support the grieving people, and that also opportunity is taken away by this COVID pandemic, and we lost the emotional support by society, and that definitely affected so many people. So also you talked about secondary losses, which were big enough, and many people actually didn't cope with that. Again, you mentioned don't get confused with the depression, because many people label it as depression rather than talking about normal depression of grief. So here you have elucidated that point also. Finally, you have talked about some special areas, particularly children, and that was really wonderful. So you said that time is the best healer, and probably the future time will help us to come out of all these aspects of grief as well as whatever losses we have sustained. So I hope this session is enjoyed by almost all delegates. Thank you very much. I will hand over this mic to my colleague for question answer.
Thank you, sir. There was no question in chat box, so I asked the floor. If any question, please ask. I would like to ask one question to sir. Whether are there any communities like that, yeah, in the families where the death happened, or in UK or anywhere else? Are there such communities to help each other?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I mean, I think there have been quite resourceful systems that people have themselves put in place to help themselves, which is, as I showed, I mean, most of that has come from Western countries, the various ways of grieving, and you can still provide support through communities coming together via virtually using technology. In India, I'm sure there will be, obviously, I mean, I don't know of everything that's happening in the space, but there have been other innovative things that have been happening, which has allowed people to gather each other's support. This is not necessarily related to grieving, of course, but it's related to the pandemic in general and how it's affected people's mental health, things like listening circles, where people are not having diagnosed mental health, syndromic mental health problems, but are nonetheless distressed by what's happening around them. And they've got together and supported each other. And that's very, very powerful. Being able to universalize the problem, being able to seek support from others who have gone through the same problems, huge amount of empathy that's generated in these kind of groups, and that does seem to help. But in terms of formal evaluation of things like these, that's not happened, but that's early days. I mean, although the pandemic is now almost 2 years old, it's still early days in terms of research to answer these kind of questions.
Hello, sir. That was a wonderful presentation. Do adolescents experience less grief compared to older and middle-aged persons? And second thing, because we are doing one activity, IPS is doing one activity with child welfare department. In that, we are seeing so many children and adolescents. So almost all are doing well. They have no grief or something like that because of loss of parents. So what is your comment about that?
There is no reason to believe that young people are less likely to experience grief. I mean, that's not the case. It's their ways of dealing with it would be different from children as well as adults, and when adolescents grieve. And hence, it's important to not think that just because it's a young person, they are not going to grieve. It's more about having open conversations with them to understand their thinking behind, or how they are looking, their perceptions of the person that has passed away and everything that's happened around that, to understand their feelings, how have they reflected on it, what are they dealing with emotionally, cognitively, in terms of behaviors, all of the things that need to be explored. I think if we were to take the position that younger people are not going to experience as much grief as adults for any reason, maybe we think they are more resilient, maybe we think that they have better social support systems or whatever, if we start thinking like that, we are more likely to miss out on problems that will occur because of grief with them, because the manifestation, as we know, of many mental health problems in younger people are different from those from adults. And so we have to be watchful. We definitely have to have a low threshold for talking about these things. And if we do find them, immediate response to that is very, very important. But the bottom line is, to answer your question, there is no reason to believe that younger people are less likely to grieve than adults.
Yes, one question. You are rightly said, sir, people use a lot of innovative ideas. For the funeral also, sometimes previously the photographs of the body was not allowed. But currently I have seen a lot of photographs, even live video has done, and many people relieved after watching this. So media was played a wonderful role.
Absolutely, yeah, yes. I agree.
One question.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, sir. My question is there any difference between a caregiver who is a medical professional and who has, undergoing the process of bereavement, grief? So is there any difference between general population and a caregiver who is bereaving, who is a medical professional, probably a sister, nurse, or a doctor? So, and how to go about the treatment therapy profile? Is there any difference between the therapies, and any experiences?
Again, I am not aware of any evidence which suggests that people who are health professionals are less or more likely to experience any kind of pathological grief. Of course, the risk factors are greater in health professionals if you have been directly working with patients with COVID, because you are seeing patients in bad state, you're seeing patients dying, etc. So the risk is increased. but there's no reason to believe that the grief that they experience would be qualitatively different from any other person who is not a health professional. So, but my main concern is not that, and my main concern is something different, which I wanted to kind of ask the previous speaker question. The main concern is not whether health professionals will experience these symptoms, or how frequently, or how many. The question is, what do health professionals do when they experience this system? Sadly, health professionals across the world have been conditioned by society to believe that they are supermen and superwomen, which they are not. They are human beings at the end of the day. So they are going to experience the same stress, same distress, the same symptoms. But the problem is, because they have been conditioned in such a way by society, they find it difficult to come out and talk about the experiences that they have had and the distress that they are experiencing, which means that that distress, that stress is going to fester and manifest in some other way. And so I think for me, the more important question is, how do we get these health professionals to come out into the open, acknowledge that I am distressed, understand that saying that I am distressed does not mean that you're a bad health professional, and then seek help when you're experiencing distress. I think those are the most important things for me.
Absolutely, sir. Every health worker had their colleague died. Many people were in grief because the co-worker died, and all healthcare worked through this. And currently, they are very much fit to fight any type of COVID wave, I think, henceforth. Thank you, sir, for excellent presentation and excellent treatment plan also. We definitely, everyone will follow this plan. Thank you, sir.
If there are no other questions, I will hand over the mic to Ashwini.
Thank you so much, sir, for the excellent presentation. I think we all have grabbed a lot of practical inputs from this session. Now I will request our chairpersons to felicitate our speaker, Dr. Abhijit, sir. Now I'll request Dr. Balchandra Kalme to felicitate our chairpersons. Thank you, sir.